So hello and welcome to today's webinar program, Interviewing for Introverts. My name is Josh Levitt, college class of 2010, and I work with the career programs team here at the University of Chicago in beautiful Hyde Park. Thank you for joining us today. This event is hosted by the Alumni Career Programs team. Our goal is to create resources and programming to help you grow in your career. Today, we will hear from counselor and author Arlene Hirsch on the subject of interviewing for introverts. This is a topic I'm drawn to because, I don't know, it seems every other time I take those Myers-Briggs personality tests, every other time it comes up introvert, comes up extrovert. Does that mean that it has poor reliability and repeatability? Maybe it means that. Maybe it means I really am sometimes more introverted, sometimes more extroverted. I'm excited to learn more about that from Arlene Hirsch. She's an author and counselor, as I mentioned. Her most recent work is hold on, I was about to say the former title, but the actual title is How to Be Happy at Work. So check out that book. Arlene Hirsch has also written the Wall Street Journal Premier Guide to Interviewing. It's called Interviewing. Highly recommend you look into it. Without further ado, Arlene Hirsch.
Thank you, Josh. Hey, everybody. Missing the J6 hearings for us. So the topic we have today is interviewing for introverts. I'd be curious how many of the people here actually consider themselves introverts.
All right, let's launch our poll. Take a moment. It's only one question. Okay. Let's see, let's give people about 5 more seconds. Tell us, do you consider yourself introverted? Yes, no, both introverted and extroverted, or I haven't considered it.
And yet you're here.
But, you know, maybe they thought it's not introversion, but introspection. Maybe it's a little bit of both. I'm not sure. All right, let's see. So let's end our poll. All right, whereas in our LinkedIn poll, about 60% consider themselves introverted, we have 84% of our attendants today say, yes, I consider myself an introvert. We have 2% say, no, I'm not an introvert. 14% say they're both introverted and extroverted. And fortunately, it seems that everyone here has considered it.
All right. So I'm going to try to address everyone's needs, although the people who don't consider themselves introverts, I don't know what to tell you. You still can use their approach. You don't have to be an introvert to use the approach, but the approach that I'm describing does lend itself well to people who are more introverted. So I think we should start with a definition. This is not going to be like a formal definition. Uh-oh. How come I'm not moving? All right.
If you go to your PowerPoint window, you should be able to click through there. Maybe you're in the Zoom window. To go to the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Okay. All right. We're in. Thank you. Sorry. All right. So, oops, we should go back one. Okay. So, the definition, there's a lot of definitions of what it means to be introverted. The one we're using is one that actually Josh kind of referred to when he talked about the Myers-Briggs. So in the Myers-Briggs, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's a personality preference test that is based on Jungian archetypes. And one of the 4 dimensions is introversion, extroversion, and they measure your introversion, extroversion on a continuum. And so if you're extremely introverted, you can be extremely introverted, extremely extroverted, or it sounds like Josh is somewhere in the middle. What the way the Myers-Briggs defines introversion and extroversion is it's where you get your energy from. And so if you get your energy, so as you can see just in my little cartoon here, the introvert here gets their energy from reading and from ideas, and the extrovert tends to get their energy from talking and interacting with people. The reason you might sometimes be an introvert or sometimes be an extrovert, so I myself fall in the middle. If you're at the extremes, it means you have more rigidity around this, and so it's harder for you to access the other part of your personality. But if you're in the middle, you have a little more flexibility. And so like in my particular case, and which I suspect may also be true for Josh, is for me, it depends on what you're talking about. So if you're talking about something, a topic that you're interested in, and you're sharing ideas with people, you can get a lot of energy from that. And but you may not get as much energy from small talk. Whereas the extreme extroverts, it often doesn't matter what you're talking about. The point is that you're talking to someone. So that's just a way to think about it. The other thing I think that's worth keeping in mind is in Myers-Briggs terms, we're talking about preferences. We're not talking about abilities. And so sometimes like you will find that a person, you can't tell that a person is introverted by talking to them because they have good communication and good social skills. And so what would happen would be you would appear to be extroverted when you're in a conversation, and then afterward you go home and you need to crash, right? Or you need to be alone with a book or some music or something. Like you can't have more extroverted activities. But it doesn't mean that you just have to isolate yourself and be alone. So just something to keep in mind. Sometimes people think of introversion as a weakness or a liability. That may happen because we are in a society that tends to value extroversion, but it's not a liability. You just have to understand how to leverage it. And then in the job interview, we're looking at how to leverage it in job interviews so that you can build rapport and have good conversations with employers. Okay. This is a very unscientific definition of the approach that I'm recommending is called consultative selling. For those of you that are thinking, oh no, I'm not a salesperson, forget the selling part of it. What you need to recognize is that a job search is a self-marketing campaign. And so you have to be able to talk about the things that you are good at. But you don't have to like sell yourself in a vacuum. And so the approach that I'm recommending, and which is in my book, my Wall Street Journal book on interviewing, is the consultative, which is a more low key, I would say. So you're not selling yourself in a vacuum. You're having a conversation with an employer about what their needs are and what you can do or how you can fulfill those needs. Okay. We want to stop for questions, Josh?
Sure. We had a number of interesting questions come in, both in advance of this webinar and so far. So one is, I imagine it's coming up, but as say someone who is a proud introvert, how can like how can a proud introvert help hiring teams understand your point that introversion can be just as pivotal as extroversion?
Okay, I'm gonna save that question for the description of the actual process, because
Okay.
that's the heart, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's the heart of it. So I'm just gonna hold that till we get to that part of the presentation.
Excellent.
Okay,
Um, then, another one is really kind of to dive in again to the consultative that consultative selling paradigm that you introduced. So is that to say that to imagine yourself not even so much as a job candidate, but as a sort of consultant
yeah,
to the hiring manager to say, I understand you have a need for someone who has this skill set, who can approach these challenges. My advice would be to hire me, basically, for these reasons.
right. So that's the right mindset, right? So like sometimes people come in, sometimes job hunters come into this and they act like they're beggars looking for a handout, right?
Mm,
But what you want to do is you want to remember that these employers, um, they're not just looking to eliminate people, they're looking to qualify people. So they have a specific need or set of needs and challenges that they're facing, and they're looking for someone to hire someone who can meet those needs. So what your challenge is to really understand what their needs are, and then to position yourself as a solution to the problem,
mhm.
right? So if you just come in and you start selling, you could be selling the wrong thing,
Sure.
right? Because you don't know, right? You don't know what they're looking for. Um, so um, in the, can we go to in the next slide, in the power of preparation? I think that job hunters often short shrift the preparation process.
Mhm.
So like preparing for the interview should be at least half of your time should be spent on that. Because you need a game plan or a strategy going into the interview. So what you want to do is you want to review whatever information you have, the website, the job description, whatever you can find about the company and the role. If you know any people who work for the company, or you know people who've had this job title, this would be a good time to use your network to talk to people so that you can prepare yourself and you can understand what they're most likely to be looking for.
Hmm.
Then we're going to say something.
No, no, please continue.
Okay, so then the next step would be to identify your strengths and weaknesses. In other words, your selling points. So when you review the website and the job description, you should be thinking like, okay, what do I have to offer these people? And what should I be talking about? And then the third step is preparing and rehearsing the stories you're going to tell. And so the stories are the examples that you provide that are the evidence, I would say. So you could say, I'm good at this or I'm good at that, but like, what's the proof, right? And the proof is in the examples. So this is just some examples of people who are more introverted, some of the things that you might have to offer. You can pick the ones that you feel apply to you, if any. And obviously, since I don't know each of you personally, you have to add your own list. But the key here is to know your strengths. The other thing that you need to be aware of is you need to know your weaknesses. So if any of you have been on job interviews where they ask you, what are your weaknesses? You should never be surprised by this question, right? When you think about what your strengths are, you also need to think about how you're going to offset any perception of weakness. So some examples of weaknesses, there's a couple different ways you can approach this. You can name something, you can name a weakness that is tangential to the job. So try not to name anything that's in the heart of the job description, right? Also, I would try to avoid like throwaway responses, like I'm a perfectionist or I'm a workaholic. I'd encourage you to stay away from those. First of all, because being a perfectionist could actually be a weakness. And also, if you position yourself as a workaholic, then don't be surprised if they expect you to work like around the clock all the time. Yeah. So you want something authentic, right? That's not in the heart of the job description, or something that you're working on. So if you have something that you know is a weakness and you've been actively working to fix that, you can mention that. And then the other one, if you can do it ingenuously rather than disingenuously, would be to name something, to name a quality, an introversion trait that might be perceived as a weakness, but doesn't have to be a weakness. But under certain circumstances, could actually be a strength. So for example, if you're a quiet person, and this is something that, that the interviewer might actually have noticed in the interview, that you're very quiet, then what you could say is that sometimes people think that I'm shy because I'm quiet, but really I'm listening. And that I think it's important to listen to what people are saying and to give thoughtful responses. Mm. So you've taken something that they might perceive as a weakness and converted it into a strength, or explained why it's not really a weakness. I wanted to say, any questions?
Oh, yeah. I think, yeah, we have had a few questions come in. I think that's a kind of playing off of this last point you made, that some of the benefits of introversion, being imaginative and creative, being an active listener, remaining cool, calm, composed, how yeah, just kind of reiterating, like, how might you then take a common misconception of introversion? Maybe pick like, what's your like least favorite misconception about introversion, and turn it into a strength, perhaps even hedging, kind of intervening on potential misperceptions during the interview.
Yeah, so my pet peeve, I would say, on the misperception of introverts would be socially awkward. Because not all introverts are socially awkward. They're just thoughtful, right? And so like, but if you are in a conversation with an extrovert, so this could happen in an interview. If you have to adjust or adapt your style a little bit to the interviewer style. So even though your preference might be to be a little more, a little quieter, you might want to be a little more talkative with an extrovert, because one risk I think that you could run into is like, if you're, that an extrovert will just like, if you're not talking, they'll just spend the whole time talking and they'll never ask you anything about yourself.
Mm.
And so like sometimes people who are more introverted, they're sort of relieved, right? They're like, oh, this is great. I don't have to say anything. And like, I can't say, if I don't say anything, I can't say anything wrong. And so they're kind of relieved. But the problem is, once you leave the room, they don't know anything about you. And so you're not a memorable person and you haven't done anything to convince them that you can do the job. So it's a flaw in the interviewer, but it's a flaw that you, as the interviewee, actually have to work around or work through, right? So that may mean actually kind of intervening in the conversation at times if you have to do that.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, yeah, thank you for elaborating on that, because just as it's important to have a deeper understanding of definitions of introversion, also those misdefinitions are important to really have a grasp on, both ones that interviewers come into the dialogue with and interviewees themselves. And what you're saying also brought to mind a concept that comes up in How to Be Happy at Work, or previously Love Your Work and Successful Follow. You write about a locus of control in the interview.
Right.
Um, and it's really about kind of negotiate, that concept really ties it has to do with negotiating who is kind of in who is in control
Yeah.
of the interview. On the one hand, there are circumstances beyond control, having to do just with how the day is taking shape. In a virtual setting, even the technology is part of things beyond the control. Then there are certain things within the interviewer's control, but there are also things about being that can be in control on the part of the interviewee. So I guess I wonder, how do you see that point that you were raising about the benefits of introversion, and how to introduce them, particularly in a given interview situation? How does that, where would you position that locus of control?
Well, so I think the interviewer takes the lead, right? And you take your lead from the interviewer. But you have to find ways and places to connect with the interviewer whenever you can. So, um, so like you can say, I'm an active listener, but you're demonstrating that in the interview. So like some of the traits or the characteristics that are the strengths of introverts will actually be subtly on display in the interview.
Mm.
So, you don't always have to be overt about this. So if you take like the highly observant. You could say, I'm highly observant, or you could just be highly observant. You know what I mean? So like you don't, it's not always so, it's what you demonstrate in the interview about how you relate to people, that is as important as your selling points.
And in that way, you can also start making that dreaded small talk. If you pose an observation, a low stakes observation, you both show that, and you can create that interpersonal dynamic that the interviewer may be looking for. Yeah, thank you.
So about that dreaded small talk, like it's it's actually really important and it's not trivial. So, um, but it's also not hard. So like, you know, if you look at Josh, you could see there's a beautiful view out the window. Like you could just comment on that. Or, you could see I'm in my home office and I have a wall of books, right?
Very
Behind me.
handsome library.
Thank you. My home office. Sometimes the cats are in here, but they're not. I kicked them out. But these are just like things that you can comment on it's just not a big deal. And it sets the stage for having a real conversation with the interviewer. So, but it's really important to be authentic and sincere. So just like pick something that you're actually curious about, right? Like find something in their office, or like if you're on Zoom, find something that looks interesting, or if you did your homework in advance, something that you know about them, maybe you went to the same school, so that you find some common ground. Okay, I wanted to talk about the stories. I know some people, I'm guessing here, are thinking, oh, I'm not a storyteller. The stories are important. When you identify your selling points or your strengths that you want to convey, the stories that you tell are the examples that demonstrate what you're talking about. So they're very important. So what you want to think about in your preparation are what are the best examples that you have of the trait or the skill that you're talking about, because that's the proof. So I know we had a question before the webinar started. There was a question about how can I demonstrate my leadership skills, or how can I show that I have leadership capabilities? This would be my answer to that question, which is, what proof do you have that you have them? So give an example, come up with an example of a time when you showed leadership. And then what you want to do is you want to script out your stories. So it's a very simple formula. You start with describe a problem or a situation that you were facing, the action that you took, and the result. So in this case, I think what I've seen the most often, that sometimes I'll say mistake that people make, is that they forget to describe the problem. They just jump right into the action. And then they spend all their time describing every minute action that they took to solve a problem they haven't articulated. And then they never get to the result, because the interviewer gets bored and they move to the next question. So you want to keep these short but relatable, and you want to give equal time to the problem or the situation, the action, and the result. And then something that Josh and I were talking about before the webinar, you want to rehearse these, but then when you deliver them, you don't want to sound rehearsed, right? So you have to like practice your stories and then tell them like a little bit differently than you practice them. So it's not so that you don't sound like a robot.
See, I mean, that's an important caveat. I know a lot of people on the call, feel that, writing things out, scripting things out, rehearsing is very helpful. At the same time, I remember you said you want to script it, rehearse it, and then toss the script.
It's in your muscle memory, right? If you've rehearsed it, you know it, right? So you don't want to sound like you're an actor delivering a line. So what you want to do is like pretend you're talking to a friend and you're telling the story to a friend, right? Instead of to a stranger. And like when you tell a story to a friend, you don't sound rehearsed, I don't think. I would hope not anyway. Uh, yeah, I guess that's all I can really say about
Well,
it.
well, and that also the beginning of the story, right? The rising action in the narrative structure is
Right,
that premise,
right,
that plot conflict, the problem is very important to emphasize because sometimes in an interview we may want quickly to say like I did this and this was the result,
right,
but that it sounds like also it's very important to establish the rationale or the premise behind that action
right,
and the result.
right,
And that may be just as important to the interviewer as ultimately what you did and what came of it.
right, right. So the other, there's two uses for the story. So I don't want you to like gloss over the story part because you think you're not an actor or a storyteller. So in some interviews, what you'll get will be an interviewer asking a general question, like, what are your strengths? And then you identify a strength, and then you tell the story as the example. Sometimes if you're in what we call a behavioral interview, they don't ask the general question, they just want the example. So you know you're in a behavioral interview when they say, tell me about a time when, or give me an example when, right? So your stories serve a double purpose. So no matter what kind of interview you're in, um, your stories will be useful. The other thing is like, you can try to anticipate the questions that they'll ask, but you probably want to have a few, what I call multi-purpose stories, right? Like no matter what question they ask, this your answer, this is your answer, right? And it would be some trait, or characteristic that's a hallmark of how you work or who you are. And so it would fit in any number of stories or questions. And also the stories, since some of you are new in your career, they don't have to be all work stories. They can be things that happened in school. They can be from volunteer activities. They can be from any part of your life. So, but the stories, so the stories help the interviewer picture you in action. So they can see how you think or how you work by the way that you addressed or tackle the situation or problem. And then that's something that's actually transferable to other situations. So they know how you would think about it. Okay. Just to emphasize my point, generally introverts spend 70% of their time listening, and then much less, and then 20% thinking, and like the smallest amount talking. In the interview, you may want to change that up a little bit so that you do more talking, because if you don't talk, they don't know who you are. So I know like sometimes people feel like, oh, the less I say, the better, because if I don't say anything, I can't make a mistake. But the truth is, saying nothing is a mistake. So what you want to do is you want to look for opportunities to build the conversation. So one of my, I would say, favorite techniques or strategies that I like would be, if an interviewer asks you a question, you obviously answer the question. If you need clarification, you ask for clarification. But after you answer your question, what you want to do then is you want to ask them a related question. So instead of saving all your questions up for the end, you want to ask them something related. So let's just say they ask you about a time that you resolved the conflict with a coworker. oh, I forgot to mention that half the questions, the behavioral questions are going to be negative. So, right, they're going to ask you about conflicts and challenges, times you failed. So you want to, don't be thrown off. So if someone asks you like, what's the worst mistake you ever made? You want to edit the word worst out of the question. And you could tell them a mistake, but always tell them a mistake that you've learned something from so that you will never repeat it again. Never name the worst one. And don't name the worst coworker, and don't name the worst manager. None of it. Never the worst. But so anyway, if they ask, say they ask you about, your approach to managing conflict, you're looking for a management position, say, and then you describe your approach, then you can ask them if they do any training, or if they have a preferred method that they like to use, or what have they found has worked best for them. So what you're doing is you're inviting them to interact with you around real challenges and real problems that they're facing. And it gives you an opportunity to tweak your response, or edit your response. Because sometimes what will happen is that, like, you thought they were looking for one thing and they were actually looking for something else. And then the feedback you get from them, you realize that you should have focused on something else. So like, so then you just say, oh, you know what I should mention, what I forgot to mention, or what I think would be helpful to mention. And then you go ahead and tell them the thing that you didn't realize they'd be interested in, but you just found out they're interested in, right? And then you're in a real conversation with the interviewer, right? And then now I wouldn't do it every time, right? Because if you do this every time, it starts to look contrived. But if you do it periodically, where you end your answer with a question, it can change the tone of the interview. So otherwise, what could happen, and what you're trying to avoid, they ask a question, you give your rehearsed answer, they look at their sheet, they ask another question, another one. And so you're in an interrogation rather than a conversation. And that's actually doesn't allow you to distinguish yourself. Questions about
I guess
that?
it also sounds like that would be a way anyway to demonstrate the active listening strengths of
Right,
most introverts.
right.
Another, and just to take your right to put into practice your your theory that of asking relevant questions as the conversation is taking place and so on. It sounds like, based on this pie chart, right,
Yeah.
that one element of prep is professional, having to do with the job description and so on, but that another part of it is really personal. Like to go in saying, I am going to talk more than I usually do.
Right.
I'm going to prepare myself to do that.
Right.
I know I tend mostly to listen and to think, but I'm going to try to listen just enough so that I can say more than I would otherwise be inclined to.
Right.
So
Right.
how do you recommend, say, making that personal preparation, to step out of the comfort zone? I'm used to speaking only 10% of the time and listening 70% of the time. How do I
Change
like
the
just like
dynamic.
prepare, to
Yeah.
change the ratio?
Yeah. So, well, if you decide in advance what points you want to make, and you know what stories you want to tell, then you should be looking for opportunities to include that information. So one way to do that is to make sure that when you answer a question, that your answer is not too short. We tell extroverts the opposite. right? With extroverts, we're like, you know what, don't go on and on and on and on, right? Like get to the point. But like with introverts, we go the other way, right? Because you want to warm it up, and you want to put a little bit of feeling into what you're talking about so that they don't feel like they're talking to a robot. And then, if you've got some good examples, ideally what will happen is that the interviewer will pick up the ball and run with it a little bit. So if you have a good interviewer who's really looking to establish a relationship and to understand you, it's a lot easier than if you've got an interviewer who makes you feel defensive.
Wonderful. And on that, excellent question in the chat from our friend Gentry Silver, who asks, turning the tables, how can the person conducting the interview help someone, the candidate who seems to be introverted really shine? What biases should that interviewer be aware of? What techniques might an interviewer do to help kind of level that playing field for a more introverted candidate?
That's a good question. You can ask them about themselves, right?
Okay.
Show some curiosity in them, because I feel like, especially with people who are new to the workforce, they just don't always know what's okay to say and what's okay to mention. And so I know, like, I've recently been coaching my nephew, who's very introverted and who's a new graduate. And what happens with him sometimes is that an interviewer will ask him something, and he'll get about something that's on his resume, and he'll get so flustered that he'll say he never heard of it, even though it's on his resume. I'm like, whoa, this isn't good. So we spent a lot of time memorizing his resume, right? But like, if I were the interviewer and I saw what was happening, I think what I would say is, I noticed that you have this on your resume. Do you remember what class you learned that in? That he's a science major. So what class you learned that lab technique in? Or, like, I see that you did a research project with Professor so-and-so. What was it like on that team? Right. So you elicit the examples from them and get them to talk about their experiences, and things that they're familiar with, right? I mean, this is their life experience, and you understand that they're nervous, and like, what you want to try to do is you want to try to set them at ease.
Well, and I noticed that you
Yeah.
started each of those questions with, I noticed this, I see on
Yeah.
your resume that.
Yeah.
So I think, so it sounds like as the interviewer, framing the question that way helps kind of build in the rationale for the question, and perhaps, would you say, makes the interview seem more like a conversation, less like an interrogation
Yeah.
or a quiz or something?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I noticed in the interviews that my nephew's been doing is that he's been looking in research academic settings. The interviews that he's been encountering are quite a bit different than the interviews that we see like in the corporate sector. So like in the corporate sector, you get a lot of people like reading from a script, right? And they're asking the question, and then they're taking notes and they're writing down the notes. But I noticed that he doesn't get any of those general questions, that they're actually trying to understand, like, what kind of team member, like, we're a research team, we're a small research group, like, what would you be like on our, on our research team? And so I've been surprised that I feel like they have been doing a better job of interviewing than some of the people I've seen in corporate, who are like, sometimes a little too married to the script, is what I would say. So if you work in corporate and you're interviewing people who you sense are very uncomfortable or stressed out by the interviewing process, like use your own relationship skills to do what you can to set them at ease. And it's not necessarily what you say so much as how you say it. And so that, so that it is more of a conversation and less of an interrogation. Right. And then if you do that, they will slip up. So like if people feel more comfortable and less defensive, you get more of the truth. Right. So if there are things that they're covering up, it actually will come out more if the environment is a little bit more relaxed than if it's an interrogation.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, here's the process. How much time we have, Josh?
Yeah, we have about 12 minutes.
Okay.
So let's delve into the process and
Okay.
see if we can have some more questions as well.
Okay. Here's the this is the interview itself. So you've done your homework, right? The other thing I would encourage you to do is think about a practice and perfect mentality. So like sometimes every interview, there's going to be things you did not prepare for, and that afterward you wish you had done differently. The best you can do, well, there's two things you can do. One is learn from your mistakes so that if it comes up again, you know how to answer the question. And then the other thing you can do actually comes up in the follow-up. So like if there's something that you forgot to mention or you realize afterward you should have mentioned, down here in the next steps, there's an opportunity to add something in that maybe you forgot to say. So just to go through the process quickly, the build rapport, here's your small talk, right? Don't ignore the small talk, just find a few things, right? Listen for clues. So in the questions that you get, you're trying to ferret out or understand what the hiring managers are looking for or what their needs are. If you can't tell from the questions they're asking, ask a few questions that help you get that information, right? So, one question I kind of like is, why is the position open? And so you find out like why the last person, if it's a new job, it means that their company is growing. And then you can ask like, well, what would their ideal candidate look like? Or what would what are they looking for? If the person left, they were promoted or they just decided to leave, then I think your question is, what are the things that you feel going forward that you would like to see from someone in this job? Were there some strengths that they had that you'd like to replicate, or maybe some things that, maybe the job has changed a little bit and there are some things you found that they didn't have that would be helpful to have, right? So the more that you can understand about what their needs are, the better position you are in to present yourself as the solution. So then if you have some idea what their challenges are, then you can identify the strengths or tell stories or give examples of times when you were able to manage a challenge or difficulty like that. And then the next step, which people tend to avoid, is address the resistance. I've never met a perfect job candidate who met every single criteria for a job. And so going in, what you need to do is you need to understand what might be perceived as a weakness, and then how you're going to overcome that objection. So maybe you don't have enough experience on PowerPoint. You tell them that you will take a tutorial, you're happy to take a tutorial and to do whatever you need to do to get up to speed as quickly as possible. Right. Sometimes the resistance is you can't be overcome because it's too big. You know, they want you to have a master's degree you don't have, but they should know that coming in, right? So like if they are requiring something and it's clear that you don't have it, I don't know why you would be there, right? But what you want to do is you want to try to understand the resistance and speak to whatever that resistance might be. So sometimes it's a gap. You might have a gap in your history. You might have taken some time off. Maybe your GPA wasn't as great as you wish it had been. Just be prepared to discuss it. So like with the GPA, like just talk about the classes that you did really well in. Right. Assuming that the classes are relevant to the job that you're interviewing for. Right. And then the next steps would be, it would be just to manage your expectations. I would say it'd be very unusual to get a job offer right then and there. So what you want to do at the very end of the interview is you want to ask the interviewer if they have any reservations or concerns that you can address. So, you know, if there is something, you should know what it is so that you have one more opportunity to dismantle that, and then ask them what the next steps are. Like, so what's the process? Sometimes they'll want to see your references. Sometimes they'll just tell you where they are in the process. And then I would say always, always, always send a thank you note. And in the thank you note, you can do it by email. You don't have to do snail mail anymore. But in the thank you note, don't make it sound like a form letter. What you want to do is you want to think about what your interview was really like, and then include something in there that reflects back why you think you'd be a good fit for the position. Or, as I said before, something that you didn't mention during the interview, but you think would be important for them to know.
And it sounds like this process also takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. If you listen for those clues, you can then perform that consultative selling.
Yeah.
To do that.
I think that the hard part, honestly, is if you don't think well on your feet, right? So it's a little harder if you're married to your script, right? Because like I said, there always are surprises, and there's always something that they're going to ask you that you did not prepare for. And and there's no way to prepare for everything. So what you do is you prepare as much as you can and deliver as best you can with the understanding that you cannot completely predict what's going to happen. Because if you try to completely predict it, you're going to be trying to control the interview, and then that's not going to work, right? Because it's a dynamic. You're not going to control it. It's going to be a relationship.
Right. And I guess it would not be a U Chicago webinar without a syllabus, without a reading list. So tell us, what do you recommend so we can dive deeper?
So the first one, the Interviewing Demystified, is just like how to develop a game plan for introverts. The second one, the Key Factor, is on just getting out of your own head and kind of understanding what the perspective of the hired person, right? So what the recruiter's looking for. The job interview is like a more thoughtful approach that works well for people who are more introverted. And then the last one, I know we didn't really talk about networking, but I did, there was a question that came in before we started the webinar. about whether I could cover informational interviews. And I knew that we didn't have time to cover informational interviews, but so I recommended this because informational interviewing is a part of networking. And I think that would be helpful for that person or for anyone else that has trouble with networking to take a look at that one.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I know we've mostly been focusing on the job interview. The informational interview is something of it's a lot of similar pieces, but also is slightly different, different dynamic, different goals, and so on. So that's a very helpful note and distinction to make.
Well, yeah, so the informational interview, just for people who aren't familiar with it, is this you're not interviewing for an actual job. You're interviewing to try to understand what a job requires or what a company is like. So it's a form of networking that's kind of a precursor to a job search.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but I also want to attend to some excellent questions that have come in. Would you mind going back to the process slide?
Sure. Here we are.
Yeah, excellent. So when it comes to, say, addressing resistance in one piece, right?
Yeah.
Let's say the candidate is, or sorry, the employer is really looking for a team player. And as an introvert, you might be more independent, more inclined to independent work rather than the collaborative enterprise. But how do you then address that resistance if you know honestly that that's not necessarily your strength?
Well, okay, so two things. One is, are you interviewing for the right job? Right. So if you really are uncomfortable working collaboratively and the job requires a lot of collaboration, it might not be the right job. But the second thing would be to think of, I mean, you've all been to school and you've all worked on group projects, right? And they're always, that you've all had opportunities where you had to work with people who maybe this wasn't your preferred person to work with. And you hopefully learn something about the role that you tend to take on when you work collaboratively, and you can speak to that. Right. So everybody has some experience working as part of a team.
And it ties back to just your earlier recommendation for maybe the story bank that you have,
right,
is also to consider, schoolwork, class, I suppose, alongside your professional work.
Right. Absolutely.
A lot of those are relevant experiences as well.
Yeah. Well, everybody does things in school that isn't always in their preference. Right.
That's where we first encounter that challenge.
That's right. That's right.
Very important. Existential.
Yeah, right. Other questions?
Yeah, just we have a lot of gratitude from our audience today for really for all your practical advice and insights. You've been a friend of the University of Chicago. Arlene used to work with students at the Harris School, and so we just want to thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity.
And again, I want to thank everybody for attending. The recording will be shared with all registrants and posted to the Chicago Alumni Careers YouTube channel. Please come check out the remainder of UChicago Alumni's Young Professional Series. I dropped a link in the chat. We have such topics as freelancing with your creativity, pivoting for profit and fun, how to learn from failures and find the career you want. And of course, our UChicago Alumni Young Professionals Networking Night, where you can practice building rapport in a low-key setting. Once again, have a wonderful rest of your week, and and we'll see you online again soon.